disappointed, and you're going to be shocked. And the more I think about it and look into it, the more I have convinced that he can be. This is going to be a tough month, a probationary period for Dennis Muilenburg. But as Mark Twain said in 1895, the reports of my demise are greatly exaggerated.
Jeff,
That's definitely the case here.
We understand.
There's a little bit less than meets the eye here. This is a big story, but go ahead.
Well, and I want to mean by that, but so important to what you're about to say is also what's about to happen. These messages were released, as we understand it from the New York Times story, as part of kind of the moves being made to prepare for him appearing for the first time on Capitol Hill. Now, are you saying he can survive both today's disclosure and that potential event?
There are those two sets of events. Today's disclosure, the two sets of congressional hearings will be pretty wilting. And what else? Just to put on the plate, in full disclosure, that the company, of course, is facing some turbulence on other fronts. The 777X is delayed on other 737 planes. There are cracks on wings that are still being investigated and repaired. There's a tanker that comes through, oddly, an Air Force tanker through commercial aviation has a big hand in that, and there are delays in parts. I mean, extensive delays on a bunch of fronts. So there's bad news out there. Can he survive these three sets of issues? Well, I think so. There's absolutely no evidence yet that the leadership has done anything wrong, that there's been any misconduct here. Just to take apart what Phil said in his report, and good for Phil for trying to get a hold of this guy, Mark Fortner's attorney. But he's banging his head against the wall. He's not going to get a response. If any listener wants to call, I think the guy's name, the attorney, is David Gerger. He's not going to respond. He's in Houston because that's this guy left Boeing and the test pilot and took a job at Southwest Airlines, and he hasn't been responding since late January when Boeing got this message, and immediately by the first week of February turned it over to the Justice Department, which is what they're supposed to do. And as most of the listeners know, when something is a criminal investigation and the Justice Department doesn't want you spreading around, because who's under investigation here? The FAA and the Department of Justice are being investigated. They couldn't give it to them for the same reason that anybody under investigation.
Jeff, what do you mean when you say you think there's less here than meets the eye?
Is that in terms of the leadership, in terms of there being something that creates great clouds, certainly there's a lot of turbulence, a lot of clouding here. There's a problem with clearly something in the FAA and the Department of Justice, which many ways operate as one entity here, in that they're
the Department of Justice and the FAA operate as one entity? I don't understand that.
Department of Transportation. Thanks a lot, Bill. The Department of Transportation is being investigated along with the FAA for possible misconduct. They're subject to investigation along with this test pilot and along with the guy he wrote to, I think his name Patrick Gustafson, who I believe might still be a Boeing attorney. I think the message you have, there was written to another
but
Boeing
let me interrupt you
personnel.
here, Jeff. I'm perplexed, frankly, to the point of wondering whether you've ever done work for Boeing. But number two, I'm perplexed.
No, I've never gotten a nickel from them. They haven't offered, but I've never gotten a nickel from them. I'm not looking for it. And I'm not personal friends.
Let me finish my thought here. Let me finish my thought. If the management knew of these messages some months ago to the point that they turned them over to the Department of Justice, presumably the head guy, Mr. Muilenburg, knew that those messages had been turned over to the Department of Justice, was aware of those messages, and if he did not until yesterday hand them over to congressional investigators, isn't he then responsible for that omission? Isn't he then at least implicitly culpable for withholding information from his chief regulator?
No.
Why?
And the reason is, in a criminal investigation, you have to ask the Department of Justice why they didn't want this information turned over.
Do we know that?
It was only in advance.
But we don't know that. We don't know whether the Department of Justice said...
Well, they chose not to. If they chose not to, if the Department of Justice didn't give it to the FAA or the Department of Transportation, wouldn't that confirm for you that they're under investigation? These are not enemy countries fighting each other. These are part of the same administration, the same executive branch, and right hand chose not to tell left hand because right hand is investigating left hand, and the company had to go along with that. And if it weren't for these congressional hearings coming up in 2 weeks, then they wouldn't have even had to tell the FAA
but we don't
now.
know, do we, Jeff, that the Department of Justice directed Boeing not to hand these documents over to anybody?
So then why don't we have the Department of Justice on the show? Somebody being asked that question,
Well,
because clearly
we'll get on
somebody.
it. We'll find out. We'll
That's
find out
the big
whether
question.
they had been directed. Because if they had not been directed to withhold the information, you have to ask the question, why then was the information withheld, right?
I believe they were directed to not put this information to the people who are under investigation. It would be like when other parts of the U.S. government that we have in other headlines today aren't being told when they're under investigation. Is if the Justice Department, the prosecutors are investigating, then you don't go over and interfere in that investigation. If the Department of Justice wanted the Department of Transportation and the FAA to know, they would have known the first week of February. They weren't told because they've been running an investigation. Meanwhile, you might want to ask, what does this guy Faulkner know? We don't know. He's not telling anybody. And he may plead fifth all the way through because he's not telling anybody what his problem was. So then another question, is this MCAS system unsafe? What does he know? We don't know. He won't tell Boeing, and he hasn't been telling apparently the prosecutors.
Yeah, we'll to your point. I mean, I don't know whether the Justice Department will comment on this, on whether they asked them to withhold information or not. But certainly Boeing should be able to answer that question as to whether they were directed not to share that information with their chief regulators.
And if there's and just think of the timing here. Is Boeing turned this over after the first crash, the Indonesian Lion Air crash, and before the Ethiopian crash? So that was in March. So this was in February that this information was given to the government. Do you think that the government would knowingly hold back information with the public safety at risk if there wasn't a criminal investigation that they were not telling the FAA and the Department of Justice about something which they thought was a clear and present danger? We have 346 deaths on our hands here. This is a horrible situation, and half of them happened after this was turned over. So that's a question you got to ask. So there isn't any evidence that the leadership did anything wrong. What's going on with this test pilot? Why he went to Southwest Airlines? Why does he not answer any questions? Why does his attorney not answer Phil LeBeau?
Okay. I mean, Jeff, thank you. We got to leave it there. And we should mention Boeing shares are now down more than 5%.